everyone, it's Sharath Jeevan from Intrinsic Labs here, and I've got the pleasure today to interview Gwen Dereymaeker as part of our Chandler Institute for Governance Leadership series. I met Gwen about a year ago, actually, through a really fascinating forum we did with Apolitical, which we're both engaged in, an amazing organization as well. And we had a really interesting first discussion around leadership. And what I wanted to do, Gwen, if it's okay, is to shamelessly ask about your life and your leadership journey. You've had such a fascinating one, and talk about some of the patterns you've seen as well. Big welcome, Gwen.
Thanks, Sharath, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Amazing. Gwen, do you want to tell us where you're sitting right now, just so everyone can locate you in that sense?
Sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Gwen Dereymaeker. I'm currently based in Cape Town, South Africa. I work in the Policy and Strategy Unit in the Department of the Premier of the Western Cape Government, which is a provincial government we have 9 provinces in South Africa, and the Western Cape Government is the government running one of its provinces, the Western Cape. And so in my role, more specifically at the moment, is to support the coordination of one of our 3 strategic priorities, which is safety. And so my focus is largely on strengthening violence prevention and then strengthening law enforcement and other components of safety.
Amazing, Gwen. You've had a fascinating career up to this point, haven't you? So do you want to give it just a small flavor of what you've been doing? So many varied and diverse roles as well in public service, around public service.
Sure. So, I mean, interestingly, I've always wanted to work in public service. I remember very well, I'm originally from Belgium, and I did my undergrad in law in Belgium. And first year at university, it was my public law, introduction to public law class. And within 2 or 3 sessions, I knew that I wanted to work or in the space, in that frontier between law and politics, and so back then I was 18. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but now I've discovered that the space where I'm at today is the space where I wanted to be almost 20 years ago, and it took me about 20 years to get there, but with a bit of an interesting journey. But yeah, so I've always wanted to work in public service, in more the public law / governance space. And so I started my career as an intern at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That then brought me to New York at the Security Council, at the permanent representation of Belgium, where I did an internship there. And then I then moved to Sarajevo. So geographically, my career started The Hague and then New York, and then Sarajevo in Bosnia, where I was an international legal officer at the War Crimes Court, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then about a week before I moved to Sarajevo, I met the man who was going to become, or who is my husband today. And so that kind of derailed things a bit. And so for a year and a half, while I was in Sarajevo, we had a long distance relationship, but obviously that wasn't going to last for very long. So then I decided to move to Cape Town, went back to university in Cape Town. And then for 6.5 years, I worked at another research center at the University of the Western Cape, where we focused as a team on strengthening accountability of law enforcement agencies who were committing human rights violations on the continent. And that brought me to Burundi. I also traveled to Cote d'Ivoire, to Ghana, but then also did a lot of work in South Africa. And like many people who want to move in the policy space, I felt quite frustrated after a number of years to be outside, and I felt like I had really great ideas, but that they were landing nowhere, and that government wasn't listening. So I wanted to enter government, and then that opportunity arose. And so I've been working for the Western Cape government with a variety of roles since January 2018.
Thanks, Gwen. A really, really fascinating career path, and very much a I sometimes talk about zigzags rather than straight lines, as you know, and
Yes.
it feels like that idea of getting to that point, but taking a different routes along the way. It wasn't a linear path. It wasn't a straight line for you as well. And what I wanted to sort of dig into a little bit is how your thinking has evolved over your career, and especially with the benefit now of being able to look back and reflect. And I'm just thinking about that first area of perspective. That when you started, if you started your career, thinking back to your finishing university and what you thought about the world and what it is now, having been this really rich tapestry of career experiences in and around public service. What do you think has changed the most? What would you say has been the big shifts?
If I look back at my journey so far with a lot of authenticity and honesty about myself, I think I've always been very ambitious, and I've always been driven by a willingness to strive for excellence in my work. And so I think that at the beginning of my career, I saw this more as an individual path. And that I think the major shift that I've made in the past 10 or 15 years is the realization that excellence is much better achieved as a team and as a collective, and that you can't achieve anything if you walk the journey alone. And I think there is this really famous quote by Judge Ruth
Is it Ruth Ginsburg? Is that right? Is the Supreme Court judge? Is that right, Gwen? Or,
Let me take that again.
Yeah.
Let me explain it. So there is this really famous quote by the famous Judge Ginsburg at the U.S. Supreme Court, who said, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's about walk a journey, but make sure that you don't go too fast to bring others along. And I think that quote in the past, especially since her death and since that quote reemerged, has really infused my perspective and my journey. And so in my view, so my perspective of success and of how you achieve that is very much informed about impact and change and bringing a group and bringing a group along. And so that takes time and changing people's minds, but also people's experience, changing my mind on certain perspectives and on how you achieve certain goals is a journey. And so I've learned to take on that journey and then maybe take a bit more time than what I thought that what I would have agreed to take on beforehand.
Yeah, fascinating. And can I ask you, just let me dig into that a bit, because it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. When you were growing up, and you grew up, I think, in Belgium, I think if I remember right, was there a very competitive culture in schooling and how you were raised in terms of thinking, or maybe not competitive, but individual type culture? Tell me more about that. What are some of the mental models earlier on as you grew up?
That's an interesting question. I don't remember growing up in a very individualistic space. I think the education system within which I operated was very individual. So a bit of group work, and both in high school. If I think of high school and university, a bit of group work, but also a lot of individual work. And so I mean the Belgian schooling and university system is quite different from the traditional Anglo-Saxon system. So lots of processing information, but with and maybe that has changed in the past 20 years, but when I was at university, not much space for critical thinking and not much space for group work. There was a bit, but I think not enough. And maybe that's informed my approach to that kind of competitiveness, but I think it's also something that I've always had in me.
Fascinating. And so that idea then of that kind of moving from individual to team, I think that's the kind of core of the journey. And you talked about something, you said something very interesting, which is it takes a lot more time than we think. And nowadays, we live in public service departments or ministries where there's huge pressure to quote unquote get results, right? We all want quick results. How have you found trying to build that culture and build that sense of team alongside that pressure alongside that need to deliver results relatively quickly as well? How do you think about that?
So I think in terms of, and you asked me an interesting, you mentioned politicians, and I think another key lesson I've learned as a public servant is that there's a time to bring issues to politicians, and that you do a lot of groundwork beforehand. Don't bring, if you, so for example, I work on violence prevention, which is, I mean, South Africa is a very violent country, and it has been for hundreds of years, and with the colonial past and oppression for about 300 years has meant that there's a lot of intergenerational trauma. So the violence is here and will be here for a long time. And so it's not a pressing issue like getting people to get vaccinated for COVID-19. And so it almost gives you space for those long-term, very sticky, complex problems that some of us deal with. First, do the legwork, convince your team, bring people along, and then elevate it through political support and for a political decision. I think that's really a key thing that I've learned is don't bring an issue too early. Get your team working beforehand. So yeah. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, really interesting. But I know the idea sort of, as I talk a lot about wicked problems that don't have an easy technical solution. I mean, obviously, safety, crime, all these kinds of things are ultimate wicked problems. There's so many multifaceted things I talked about in my book, Intrinsic, as you know, that the idea that many of the things that we think we have reduced crime around the world may not have done. So maybe complete other factors at play here. And so that idea of sort of taking time with the team to think about things together, develop some ideas. How far do you go? Do you sort of, I'm just thinking about the oven, do you put the cookies in and wait till they're fully baked? Do you wait till they're sort of half baked and sort of moist? Or when do you sort of go to the minister and say, look, we've got something cooking here that's looks like it's tasting good, but what point is that really?
Well, I'm busy working on one of those issues at the moment, and the team won't agree as to when we're ready. And I guess when you're dealing with a very complex issue, you feel like you're never ready. So at one point, you just have to jump. But I think having the key thing is having a common understanding, a common vision of where you want to get to and how you'll get there. So at least a high level understanding of your outcome, of your goal, and then of your process. It doesn't have to be very detailed, but there are key ingredients that go into those two components that I would say have to be there before you're ready to elevate an issue. And that's when you have the luxury to be able to build that. And that's because I think that would apply when you're dealing with more long-term sticky problems. Because for some urgent issues, you just can't.
And so
you don't have enough time. Yeah.
So those kinds of issues. So you said when they're sort of very wicked, they're very sort of intractable. Yeah. How do you do that? So is it one where you feel there's enough you understand the problem better, and so therefore it's time to talk to the minister, or is it that you've got some emerging solutions coming? What's the right time for that engagement, do you think?
So I think it's both. So I think as public servants, like you said, we're always pressed with time, and we always need to develop solutions quickly. The problem with developing solutions quickly is that you don't take time to understand the problem. We're often not allowed in the civil service, at least in the spaces that I operate in, and I think it's, I mean, I've engaged with a number of civil servants from around the world, and I think it's quite a common experience, is that being allowed to spend time understanding a problem, especially a complex problem, in all its nuances, and then being able to learn and reflect when starting to develop solutions and implementing them. Luxuries that can be provided by your leadership, but you've got to make clear from the beginning that you need them. It's often not something that's going to be encouraged. At least, I mean, I'm kudos to the managers and the leaders who recognize the importance of taking time to understand problems and of learning, but it's unfortunately not yet that common. And so I think the two key things is taking time to understand the problem, and then creating spaces for learning, and that really allows you then to grow and to bring those nuances, because complex problems have nuances, and nuances have to be understood and dealt with. Otherwise, the likelihood of your solution not landing and not being sustainable that risk is very high.
Really interesting. So, and so those spaces you talked about, is that a space with experts? Is it a space to discuss it between the team and the minister? How do you create those spaces, Gwen? And what have you found really works to get that movement?
So in my view, because of the nuance, you need to have a diversity of views and a diversity of voices in the room. And ideally, that would mean implementers, that would mean people who will access a service or who currently access a service, those who implement it, those who fund it, those who monitor it, those who design it, those who evaluate it, and all of those perspectives, and bringing all of those perspectives together and helping people make sense of different views is difficult. Which is, I mean, that brings me to another kind of learning of the past few years, is that facilitation and to address complex problems is so important.
Yeah.
We have a lot of literature on that, but that is so important, because bringing different voices in the room with different power dynamics, because government comes with power and hierarchy, etc. And navigating power and hierarchy can be tricky, and therefore facilitation, I think, of those spaces is very important.
Fascinating. So we talked a lot about perspective and that need to bring different perspectives together almost, right, and create those safe spaces and that ability. I want to move on to this idea of essence and who you found yourself to be a leader. I think you touched on something important I just wanted to bring up to begin with, the idea of being that kind of integrator, facilitator, bring these different diverse viewpoints together, trying to take away some of the power dynamics as well. Is that the core? I mean, so how much do you think the essence of a great leader in public service is about those sorts of process skills, if I want to call it, what in my words, sort of broader mastery essentials, versus the technical skills of being an expert in safety or crime prevention or whatever it might be? How do you see those two things? Which is more important?
And I would actually add a third skill to the two that you've identified. So there's a process one, there's the experts on the topic, and then there's the doer.
And sorry, Gwen, I missed the last part there.
All right, and then there's the doer.
The doer, okay, yeah, the person who can actually
implement. There's a person who actually implements.
Yeah.
And very often those skills are not shared by the same people. And that's okay, as long as we all acknowledge that we all need each other.
Yeah.
And so I think each of those skills is essential. As I was earlier talking about all of the diverse views that you need in a room, you need them all in a room.
Yeah.
And maybe not always the same room, depending on where your process is at. But I think that to resolve complex problems, you need those diversity of views. And whether some are more important than others, I don't think so. But it's also important for each to learn to understand each other, which is another difficult skill sometimes.
Got it. So I get the sort of the facilitator, the process skills that brought the process mastery. You've got the technical domain or subject matter mastery. The last bit about the doer, is that a different, like, so I guess at the level you're working at a provincial level, I understand. So who is the doer in that world? What does that person look like in a team?
So I'm going to talk about the space that I know, because so in South Africa, provinces have competency over two big social components, which is education and health, plus social services, and then we have a bit of some of our powers are around road infrastructure, etc. But I work more in the social space. I'm going to talk about those three competencies that we have, which is social services, education, and health. And so your doers are your teachers and your principals, are your nurses and your doctors and your health workers who go and bring medication to the elderly or visit young moms after they've given birth. And then in the social services, all your social workers who have to intervene in very difficult circumstances and who are also often completely overworked. But so to me, those are the doers, and those are that we also have to work with, because if you want to scale up or change the way a problem is addressed, you'll never be able to implement it by yourself. So you'll need to speak to the people who are implementing and who are providing services to communities currently to understand their working dynamics and their appetite and their ability to then change.
And do you engage them? How much of the engagement is in understanding the problem or also the solution, or how do you see that both, or what's more important?
Doers are probably the ones who understand the problems best,
okay,
and know what solutions what solutions could work. Often doers don't have time. I mean, my experience of speaking to what we call frontline staff is that they often don't have time to either get their head above water and think about another way of accessing a service, because in government you receive guidelines and norms and standards that you have to comply with, and then that's just how services have to be delivered, and that's what you follow. And so, I mean, I was talking about a space to reflect. I think so. Frontline staff certainly don't have that space to reflect. And so, but then, so what's useful is to then bring someone else in who can almost elevate the issues that they encounter in the services that they provide, and together, through a joint journey, have time to broaden our perspective on what the problem actually is, or actually could be, what the problems, the different components of that problem, and what the solutions could be, and how solutions could change. And so, because it's one component, because a complex problem is so transversal and there's so many dynamics, who brings all the pieces together? And it's rarely one single frontline staff or an NGO delivering a service, also frontline staff, who has the ability to see all of the pieces. They know where all of the pieces are. It's just their job is to deliver services, and having that more bird's eye view is a luxury that, again, I think many frontline staff don't have.
Yeah, really powerful. So going back to your essence then, Gwen, is it to be that integrator, to bring those voices, the doer, the expert, and the process, person with the process skills together? Is that how you see your strengths, your career, the core of who you are now as a leader in public service? Definitely.
I think one of my strengths, I would say, is to be quite comfortable navigating complexity. Something that I often joke, or we often joke as a team, that we wish one day was easy, because dealing with complexity is never easy, but it's something that I enjoy very much. And then one of my motivators, beyond bringing all of those voices together, absolutely, it's also to experience change. It's when you manage to convince a colleague, convince a partner of an idea, and of possibly re-looking at how a service is provided, or how a problem is addressed. And being able to see that change together, but also then learning from each other. So it's really that journey of change that motivates me. Motivates me in my leadership journey and in my public service career at the moment. When things get stuck, I move to something else, because if there is no change, it's not a space where I'm very happy. Delivering the same service all the time without questioning whether it's working or not is not a space where I'm happy. So I like spaces that flow and that move, and where questions are asked.
What I see now, it's really inspiring. I can see in your eyes, even across the Zoom screen. And one thing that I talk a lot to senior civil servants about is there's often this temptation. The world is wicked, in sort of my language, and there's this desire to want to make it kind, to reduce it down to simple PowerPoint or boxes, because it looks easier on a log frame or a plan or a budget or whatever it might be. What would you say to those colleagues? How have you managed to embrace wickedness, complexity, rather than sort of try to eliminate it? I'm curious there.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure I have the answer to that question. All I can say is, as I was saying, sometimes I wish things were easy, and I think one of the very sad realities of our political environment today is that people long for simplicity, because the world has become too complex, which means populism and extremism are on the rise, obviously, because populists are the one who can sell simple messages, or who can more easily sell simple messages, whereas there are no simple solutions to today's problem. There are no silver bullets. There's just that no longer exists. And so I think I'm actually not quite sure how I would answer your question. What advice? Just one step at a time. Identify some quick wins. So it's a journey. Understanding that it's a journey, that you won't see results straight away. That nobody's. The issue with complexity is that the journey isn't clear from the start. So sometimes it might feel very scary to walk on a journey where a clear log frame or a clear project plan with set time frames and deadlines often do not exist when you address complex problems. And understanding that that's okay, but making sure that you've got sufficient check-in points to see where you're at, where you wanted to go, what needs to continue, and what needs to change is very important. So a much more agile approach to governance and to implementation than a traditional project management approach.
Really interesting.
But at the same time, keeping that project management approach to know where you're going. Otherwise, it can go in all directions. But yeah, so I think making sure that you see that it's a journey and it's little steps one after the other, and then taking your time to reassess where you're at, and then identifying some quick wins, and to make sure that to actually congratulate yourself on having done that first step.
Fascinating one. So I've got a really clear sense of your perspective, how it's changed, as how you've thought about complex or wicked problems very differently, very deeply over the course of your career. Got a good sense of your essence, that idea of being able to bring these different groups together, but also move forward and see change. It's not just about getting people in the same room. That's not easy to begin with, but actually coalescing all of that into a clear path and a clear sense, and trying to have some quick wins, even though we acknowledge the enormity of the problem around us, but we can still make initially some small dents in the problem to get moving. Is kind of what I'm hearing there as well.
Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of your direction now as a leader, like that's a very clear point of where you are now. Where do you want to go in terms of harnessing your leadership direction in the chapter ahead, really?
So ideally, if I'm allowed to continue working in that space of addressing long-term social ills, it's certainly a space that I would like to continue. I'm very fortunate at the moment that as a team, we have the support of our political leadership and of our administration in looking at addressing long-term social ills differently. And so having that authorization, having that buy-in from your leaders or from your senior management is absolutely essential. And so I'm hoping that I'll continue having that support. But certainly as a team, we'd like to continue exploring different solutions to those very complex problems of violence and of crime and of gender-based violence, etc., etc. Yeah.
Really, really powerful. And in terms of things you want to develop as a leader, in terms of new areas of mastery, anything that particularly jumps to mind around that, a long-term direction?
So I think that because I'm in the policy space and because I'm in that, I focus on getting a bird's eye view of complex problems, but my understanding of issues is often quite high level. But also, like you say, I'm in the process space, I'm in the facilitation space. I don't like very often for what I would call thinkers. We are quite detached from the doing space.
Right.
We're going to force ourselves to go to move into the doing space and to work with those who are at the core phase of service delivery much more often. And I think it's something that I don't do enough, like I think many people in my space. And so I would say in the next year, I really want to make an effort to go out much more and speak to the social worker who needs to go on a Saturday night remove a child from a dysfunctional home, or speak to the nurse who on a Sunday morning has seen 10 gunshot wounds in the emergency room, and to understand their realities and how they experience the issues that we're also trying to address in our lofty offices at headquarters.
Yeah, re-residence. I spent, I worked with hundreds of thousands of teachers, as you know, and yeah, I just wish I'd taken some time to go and actually do some training to be a teacher, to see how it played out, and how difficult it really was as a role as well. I spent time in classrooms, but again, that realization of I would love to be connecting more back with the doers, as you said, in your language as well. That sort of side is they're so critical. They're the people who make a system ultimately work and make any social ill, be addressed over time as well. So that really resonates there also. And do you think, I mean, with that direction piece, that idea of a career path around these process mastery, this facilitation mastery, is that starting to become recognized in government as a path? Because traditionally civil service has always valued the technical, right? It's always been about you're an expert in this area or whatever, or in policy, or what do you think? Are you seeing any trends in that area?
Unfortunately, not yet.
Okay.
But something that I've asked and that I've been given, and what I've seen around me is often when you have a good idea and when you're listened to. So it's all about obviously building a reputation and showing that you are also able to listen, not only implementers but also obviously listen to political leadership and leadership in the administration. And that creates, when listening both ways, trust emerges. And when there is trust, there is much more space, I think, to negotiate conditions around the delivery of a specific output. And so it's not a skill or it's not a competency that's particularly drawn on or sought after, but certainly what I've experienced is when we ask for it, we can get it, because there is that trust.
Amazing. And I think it feels like you've also built that from a position of trust, but I really hope this discussion, Gwen, really inspires other people, many of whom may be earlier in their journeys in public service or mid-career or even senior in their career, to think about this as a legitimate path in terms of direction. Because I think too often we take these more traditional paths or directions around technical skills, or of course frontline skills as well, but that idea of a middle path where it's really bringing these people together and bring that towards action and change and long-term change is a really, really exciting one. We'll just talk about the idea of assumptions. So we talked about perspective, your essence, the direction you're taking, which is a really interesting one. And what I heard is you want to be even closer to the action in terms of doers in this continued phase as well. In terms of assumptions, if you go back to how you got into public service, and you took many turns in the path, as you described earlier, some very fascinating ones, what would you want to have changed in how public servants are developed and nurtured in terms of those assumptions that could help them get to what you described, you think, as well?
I think one of the I think I would say you're very much the master of your own life. And so I think there is, if you feel that you've got something to bring to the space, whether it's the policy space or the implementation space or the process and the bringing together space or the political space, it's all spaces that I strongly believe are open to everyone and are open to people who are not part of the mainstream kind of traditional criteria of getting there. Then, I mean, in terms of if I think of the assumptions that have helped, so I mean, obviously, I think every space is different, and we know that in some spaces it is difficult to enter government. So I don't think there is a magic recipe to each space. But again, I've spoken about teams and relationships at the beginning, and unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know if it's fortunately or unfortunately, but relationships still matter enormously. And so building relationships, building networks, reaching out today, it's becoming easier. Reaching out to on LinkedIn to specific people that you admire, etc., might help you, and then start building connections. Start also building some form of mentorship, possibly to allow you for that, to allow you to do that transition. In terms of useful and unuseful mental models or assumptions that I think I found very useful in the space I'm in, is I think the useful assumptions are those of hope and of wonder. And I think hope is a quality that we don't find in political leaders often, but it's a quality that I really admire. It's the possibility of change. It's the possibility of a better life in a better society. And unuseful assumptions is cynicism, is thinking that things aren't going to change, that things aren't going to improve, or that you're better than the others and you understand complex problems better than the others. And if you're incapable of taking a team with you, it means that they don't understand. And so an inability to self-reflect, I think, is an unuseful assumption and a very unuseful mental model. So I would really encourage people to being open to being questioned and to open to being challenged.
Really interesting. And some of the work Adam Grant's been doing around the idea of being willing to question yourself and to challenge your most basic assumptions. That's really important, to not get too set in our ways, especially later in life as we become more established as well. That's really powerful. Those reflective spaces, Gwen, as well. So yeah, so I'm hearing sort of a couple of things. One is that chance to step back, keep asking yourself the key questions. Are you going on the right path? Be open. Wonder, curiosity are really critical. The other bit I think that's interesting with your journey, it sounds like, is that you carved out this role, right, in the ministry in the province, and it wasn't a role, from what I heard, that was already there. You had to, I use this word, job crafting. You had to almost job craft this role, and I don't know, negotiate this with your leaders there. Was that any tips for others who may want to do something similar? How do you create that conversation? How do you sort of persuade colleagues that this is really worth their time being invested in?
So, I mean, again, I was I get hired for a role that had a very specific job description, but I think job descriptions can be fluid.
Yeah.
And so once you are in a role, if you're very passionate about a specific issue, it's up to you to craft sufficient time to be able to focus on that issue. I'm a firm believer of the 80-20 rule. And so I think a lot of things can be delivered of acceptable quality, and that if that gives you more time to dedicate to what you're passionate about, then do that. Then prioritize what you love, prioritize what motivates you over what has to be done. Make sure to always deliver the best quality work possible, but be very flexible in terms of what you prioritize, and always remember to prioritize what you love. I think that's absolutely essential.
Interesting. Yeah. So the idea that you may go into a job, and I think there's so many people, like leaders I talk to, especially in public service, it's like the job description, that famous JD is some kind of binding constraint. It's like a prison that you can't get out of. And I think the idea that there are certain things you have to do. If I heard you right, Gwen, that of course you've got to deliver certain things that are in there, but you also have quite a lot of room to think about it, craft it, and make the case. And as you build trust, you can be more and more adventurous on that journey as well. So absolutely, yeah. Your time and your JD is actually yours, and so it's a decision that you have to take. So yeah. And I try to encourage leaders to think about work as a two-way street now. It's no longer we just go and solve or serve our organization's purpose. Of course, we need to be doing that, but they also need to serve ours. And the idea of that two-way street, almost like a marriage where both sides see real value in what they're doing. And I think that can lead to the most productive experiences and the most powerful ones, the most impactful ones for our citizens ultimately as well, of course.
Yeah.
So, last area, we've had a really rich conversation, so thank you. Just the last area of learning, and you've kept learning and evolving through your career. How have you created that learning culture in yourself? How do you try and create it among colleagues? Are there any tips you'd give those in public service to think about that learning agenda?
So in my experience, learning, I think adult learning and learning while you have a full-time job, and while you have a family, and I really don't want to make this a female issue, so I would strongly encourage fathers who listen to this presentation to equally take care of their families as they do for as their wives do, or as their partners do. I'm very fortunate to have a partner with whom I share household duties completely equally, and we have 2 young children. But if you add a full-time job and then a family to that, or another passion, or because we also many people have passions beyond just the children and their job, and that's certainly very important. But it means that spaces for learning and opportunities for learning are scant. And also, unfortunately, in my experience, learning opportunities provided by the civil service can also often be inadequate. And so where the skills that are nurtured and strengthened in the private sector aren't always the skills and the technical or the non-technical skills like facilitation are less readily available in the public service. Again, you've got to craft out those learning opportunities, I think, much more than in the public and then in the private sector, I would say, in my experience. And yet those opportunities exist, and so it's about you to identify them, make time to learn. Obviously, we think of online resources. There is a lot of technical knowledge that's available online, but I mean, I often say that the kind of complex problems that the public service has to deal with are much more complex than the private sector, and so certainly technical knowledge is not enough. And I mean, not that soft skills are not important in the private sector, but what I would say, if I reflect on my learning journey, is that learning from others and that kind of informal knowledge is as important. And so, I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, going to see and speak to frontline staff, I think are amazing learning opportunities that are not valued enough, and that are equally important to the kind of technical knowledge. And I've seen in my space a growing acknowledgement of the importance of learning from others and from experiences rather than just from online courses, whether free or fee-paying courses. So, I mean, so I think learning opportunities can be found both in that kind of technical space and that relational space, and it's really important to grow both.
What I heard there is sort of the idea of sort of, obviously you've got the online side, but actually trying to take those more socialized experiences, actually time maybe in the field or working with doers and so on. And as you said before, Gwen, those are rich learning opportunities as well. And are there any tips on how to structure that learning? Because often what we do spend a day in a classroom or in a police cell or whatever it might be, talking to crime prevention officers, safety officers. But often it might feel, okay, I've had a good day, but what do I do with this? Any ideas how to package that learning or apply that learning really powerfully in our lives?
I don't think there is a very structured and formal way, or I haven't discovered yet, and if others have, I would love to hear about it. But I think those experiences are, if one takes, I mean, journaling is a very good way of already practicing what you learned. And so after you've had one of those engagements, take a few notes so that it gets processed somewhere in your brain, and then those learnings will reemerge when you have when there are opportunities through that social learning to inform a process. Those connections are then made. I find that the richness of all those learning opportunities resurface. You know, it's like a light bulb in your head when the opportunity arises. I mean, there might be much more formal ways to incorporate those learnings, but unfortunately, I haven't discovered them yet.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of those connections happening, Gwen, as well. And I mean, two things I'd probably just add would be, one would be journaling is great as well. I think it's very powerful, as you said, Gwen, and maybe also posting, writing for others. You could be an email to your team saying, we can write saying we saw these things today. When talking to police officers, this is what I noticed, or use LinkedIn or any of these kinds of posts as well to share that more widely. And yeah, maybe the last thing was just about perhaps bring ideas together and being able to share connections between those things as well, like getting those things, perhaps with your manager as well, making sure in the one-to-one that you talk about it. This is what I learned from my day here. So yeah, a couple of very small things. Yeah, really had a rich conversation. Anything that we missed, anything that you wanted to stress that's been important?
No, I think don't be shy of complexity. I think complexity is just part of our lives, and it's messy and it's scary at times, but it's okay. It's just what we have to deal with.
No, I think it's been such a powerful theme, and thanks for such a wonderful conversation, because I think the world is moving to this more wicked world as the pandemic has shown us. We've had, yes, the vaccines came, but really it was questions of how do you organize society, right? Organize ourselves to confront, how do we, protect our businesses, our livelihoods, our health. Those were such wicked problems, right? There was no vaccine for those. And so it's interesting how that's been the core actually in the challenges. And yeah, I think what you've done today has given a lot of inspiration to those in public service about embracing that wickedness and not shying away from it, and seeing if they can take the mantle and develop a new set of skills and leadership behaviors that can really be apt to confront that reality. That's so a huge thank you. And
well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. It was a wonderful discussion.